Standard procedure for an unnatural homicide. The Standard Operating Procedure Manual for Homicide Investigation is 1,000 pages thick, but it offers no guidance for when the only physical evidence is a lingering scent of ozone and a perfect circle of silence where the victim used to be. My job begins where that book ends. Consider this your orientation. The strobes painted the alley in silent, rhythmic pulses of red and blue, washing over brick walls slick with condensation. Officer Elias Thorne knelt, not by the body, but by the space where the body had been. The concrete was clean, scoured to a pale gray as if by industrial solvent, yet the air held the thick, coppery tang of a slaughterhouse mixed with the sharp, sterile scent of ozone after a lightning strike. Nothing remained of the subject but a dark stain on the opposite wall, a silhouette frozen mid-stride, impossibly crisp, as if a man's shadow had been burned into the brickwork. His new partner, Maya Chen, stood rigidly by the mouth of the alley, her knuckles white where she gripped her flashlight. Her academy training, her field experience, every procedural instinct she possessed was screaming that this was wrong. "There's no casing, no entry wound on the shadow, no anything," she said, her voice tight but controlled. The call was for shots fired. Neighbors reported a sound like sheets of metal tearing. "How do we write this up?" Thorne rose slowly, his movements deliberate, practiced. He didn't look at the shadow stain or the unervingly clean patch of ground. His focus was on Chen. He was evaluating the tremor in her voice, the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her eyes kept darting back to the impossible evidence as if a second look might make it conform to the laws of physics. "The report will be filed under Code 1099. Officer assist, unfounded," he stated, his tone as flat and gray as the pavement. The noise was a truck backfiring. "We conducted a patrol, found nothing of note, and returned to service." Chen finally tore her gaze from the wall to stare at him. Disbelief warred with the ingrained discipline to obey a senior officer. "Unfounded?" "Thorne, a man is gone. He's painted on the damn wall." "There is no man," Thorne countered, his gaze unwavering. "There is an anomalous stain pending review by city maintenance. There is a patch of clean concrete. There is nothing here that requires a police report, because according to the manual, nothing here happened." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. The rhythmic wash of the emergency lights illuminated the deep-set lines around his eyes. "You spent your career learning the procedures for when things go wrong. Now you need to learn the procedures for when they go sideways. Welcome to the addendum, Officer Chen." He reached into his duty bag and pulled out a standard incident report clipboard, but the pen he handed her was a heavy, metallic cylinder with no visible nib. "The first rule is the most important. The official report is for them." He gestured vaguely toward the quiet, sleeping houses beyond the alley. "It keeps the world stable. It ensures panic doesn't do more damage than the event itself." He paused, letting the weight of the statement settle in the cold air. "The real report, that's for us. And you write it with your memory, because nothing about this can ever touch paper." The radio crackled, a burst of static followed by the dispatcher's clipped, dispassionate voice. 2 King 4, respond to a 415 Bravo at 1121 North Ash Street. Single family residence. Reporting party is a neighbor, states he heard a high-frequency tone then silence. No answer at the door. Maya Chen glanced at the mobile data terminal. 415 is a disturbance. What's the Bravo designator? Elias Thorne didn't take his eyes off the road, navigating the quiet suburban streets with an unhurried precision. It's a sub-classification. Not in the standard manual. He made a left turn, the headlights sweeping across manicured lawns and sleeping houses. Bravo means the initial patrol unit on scene has confirmed visual evidence that falls outside established forensic parameters. It means we go in first, and the crime scene unit waits for our all clear. A knot tightened in Chen's stomach. Outside parameters? Like the alley? The alley was an erasure, Thorne said. Bravo calls are usually about additions. The house on Ash Street was indistinguishable from its neighbors, a tidy, 2-story colonial with pale yellow siding and a porch swaying gently in the night breeze. 2 patrol cars were parked at the curb, their light bars off. The uniformed officers stood on the sidewalk, their posture a mixture of alertness and a deep, instinctual reluctance to get any closer to the front door. One of them, a young officer named Evans, met Thorne at the walkway, his face pale. "Detective," Evans began, his voice low. "The door was unlocked. We cleared the house, just the one victim. We backed out and secured the perimeter. I've never seen anything like it." Thorne nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement, not surprise. "Good call, Evans. You and your partner maintain the outer cordon. No one in or out until I say so. That includes the NE and forensics." He led Chen up the porch steps. The air inside the house was still and cold, carrying a faint, cloying sweetness like overripe fruit. The living room was immaculate, vacuum lines visible on the carpet, magazines neatly stacked on a coffee table. But the orderliness only served to amplify the profound rawness of the scene as focal point. A man was seated in an armchair, facing a blank television screen. From the neck down, he was dressed in a simple polo shirt and slacks. From the neck up, his head was folded. It wasn't crushed or broken, it was creased along impossible lines, collapsed inward on itself like a complex piece of origami, the planes of his face intersecting at angles that defied three-dimensional space. There was no blood on the victim himself, but the wall behind him was covered in a delicate, branching pattern of crimson that spread out like frost on a windowpane, each line a perfect 90-degree turn, forming a labyrinthine spiral that converged on a single point directly behind the victim's head. The spatter defied gravity, momentum, and reason. Chen drew a sharp, involuntary breath, her training warring with the visual paradox before her. "How?" she started, but the word died on her lips. She tried to reconcile the image with ballistic reports, with blunt force trauma, with any known cause of death. Nothing fit. It was like looking at an Escher drawing made of flesh and bone. Thorne ignored the body for a moment. He walked the perimeter of the room, his eyes scanning the ceiling, the floor, the corners where the walls met. He pulled a small, weighted plumb bob from his pocket. He let it hang, and instead of pointing to the floor, the silver tip angled a discernible 15 degrees toward the armchair. "The localized gravitational field is warped," he said, his voice a calm murmur in the oppressive silence. He reeled the line in. Whatever did this didn't just kill him. It bent the space he occupied. He finally turned his attention to Chen, who was still frozen, her gaze locked on the victim. "Your report," he said, his voice pulling her back from the edge of disbelief. "What do you see?" She swallowed hard, forcing herself into a procedural mindset. No signs of forced entry. No sign of a struggle. Victim is a male, Caucasian, appears to be in his 50s. Cause of death is, she faltered. Visually inconsistent with known weapons or trauma. "Good," Thorne said. "Now, look away from him. Look at the room. Tell me what's missing." Chen scanned the space again. The neatness, the order. There is no mess. No overturned furniture. No, her eyes widened slightly. There are no personal effects. No photographs, no mail, no keys on the table. It's like a model home. "Exactly," Thorne confirmed. This wasn't a murder. It was a redaction. Something came here for him, and only him, and it edited him out of the world so precisely that it folded the physics around him to do it. He knelt, producing a small, metallic tuning fork. "Standard procedure is now suspended. Our job is to find out why he was redacted, and ensure the editor doesn't have any more pages to mark." Thorne bypassed the standard issue crime scene kit in the trunk of their vehicle. He retrieved a heavy, black Pelican case, its surface scarred with the history of countless calls like this one. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was an array of instruments that bore only a passing resemblance to forensic equipment. There were no fingerprint brushes or DNA swabs. Instead, there were polished brass devices, coiled copper wires, and lenses ground from a dark, obsidian-like glass. "Forget prints, fibers, and serology," Thorne said, handing Chen a pair of dark-lensed glasses. "Conventional evidence is a byproduct of conventional physics. It's useless here. The first rule for a scene like this is that you don't look for what the suspect left behind, you measure what the universe forgot to put back." He picked up a device resembling a thermal camera, but its sensor was a complex arrangement of silver filaments. This is a null-field photometer. It doesn't read temperature, it reads its absence. He switched it on, and the small screen displayed the room not in a spectrum of heat, but in shades of gray. Most of the room was a uniform slate color, but 3 distinct patches glowed with an absolute, starless black. One hovered in the air just to the left of the folded victim. Another coated the surface of the blank television screen. Thermal voids, Thorne stated, pointing. Pockets where the ambient energy has been completely negated. They're like footprints. Document their positions and approximate dimensions. Chen took the device, the cold metal unfamiliar in her hands. She put on the glasses, which made the room's light seem dimmer, flatter. Through the photometer's screen, the voids were unnerving, holes punched in reality. She began taking measurements, her voice a low, steady monotone as she recorded the data into a small, leather-bound notebook Thorne had given her. Void 1, coordinates approximate, 0.7 meters from north wall, 1.5 meters from floor. Roughly spherical. Her police academy instructors would have failed her for such imprecise language, but here, it was the only language that applied. Next, Thorne produced a laser measuring tool, but instead of a single beam, it projected a grid of faint green lines. He directed her to aim it at the corner of the room behind the armchair, where the ceiling and 2 walls were supposed to meet at a perfect 90-degree junction. As the grid overlaid the corner, the lines that should have remained straight visibly warped, curving inward as if being pulled toward an unseen point. The digital readout on the device flickered erratically between 91.4 degrees, 88.7 degrees, and ERR non-Euclidean. Dimensional stress, Thorne explained, his tone that of a mechanic diagnosing a faulty engine. The event created a localized warp. The architecture here isn't physically damaged, but it's conceptually bent. We document the deviation. It gives us a sense of the perpetrator's power and methodology. The final piece of their process was collecting the residue. A fine, silvery dust coated the windowsill, almost invisible to the naked eye, and it pulsed with a faint scent of ozone and charged air. Thorne handed Chen a collection kit. It wasn't a sterile baggie but a small glass vial suspended inside a larger jar by a network of magnets, creating a vacuum seal. Using a pair of non-metallic tweezers, Chen carefully scraped a few grains of the dust onto a slide, which she then levitated into the inner vial before sealing the entire apparatus. That's the signature, Thorne said quietly. It's what everything else, the voids, the bent space, the body, is a reaction to. With their unique evidence collected, Thorne stood back and surveyed the room. The folded man in the chair, the gravity-defying blood, the invisible wounds in spacetime. To any other officer, it was a chaotic, unsolvable horror. To him, it was a set of data points. "All right," he said, turning to Chen. "We're done. Don't let the forensics team in." He closed the Pelican case with a definitive snap. "They'll find a burst aneurysm and trace amounts of household cleaners. Let them. Their job is to close the case while our job is to close the door it came through." The following morning, the official investigation on Ash Street was a study in methodical futility. The crime scene unit had dusted for prints that didn't exist, cast impressions of footprints that were never made, and bagged trace evidence that would reveal nothing more than carpet fiber and lawn fertilizer. To the uniformed officers and detectives in crisp suits, the death of Martin Fincher was already being categorized as one of those frustrating, inexplicable cases destined for a cold case file, a probable aneurysm, a bizarre but ultimately natural death, with the strange scene attributed to the eccentricities of a man who lived alone. Thorne and Chen began the canvass, a procedural ritual they both knew would be officially fruitless. They worked their way down the street, knocking on doors and asking the same sterile questions. "Did you see anything unusual last night? Did you hear anything? Do you know if Mr. Fincher had any enemies?" The answers were a predictable chorus of suburban obliviousness. A man 2 doors down had been watching the game and heard nothing. A woman across the street thought she saw the headlights of a delivery truck around 10. Most hadn't known Fincher well. He was a quiet man, kept to himself. Chen recorded their non-statements in her official notebook, a collection of useless data for a report that would only serve to obscure the truth. She could feel the palpable wall of normalcy the neighborhood had erected around the bizarre event at its center. Their last stop was the house directly next door, a small bungalow with a garden overflowing with unruly rose bushes. An elderly woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and hands stained with soil answered the door. Her name was Alma Rodriguez. "Officers," she said, her voice raspy but clear. I already spoke to the young man in the uniform. I told him I saw nothing. "We understand, ma'am," Thorne said, his tone gentle, disarming. "We're just following up. Sometimes people remember small details later on. Anything, no matter how insignificant it seems." Alma hesitated, her gaze drifting past them toward Fincher's silent house. "You aren't looking for a person, are you?" she asked, her question so directed caught Chen off guard. "Why would you say that, Mrs. Rodriguez?" Chen asked, her professional curiosity piqued. The old woman finally met their eyes, a flicker of something that wasn't fear, but a deep, weary certainty. "Because what I saw wasn't a person." "Not really." She opened the screen door wider. "Come in. I want to speak about it on the porch." Inside, her small living room smelled of lemon polish and old books. She sat in a worn armchair, her hands clasped in her lap. I was awake, by the window. My hip was bothering me. I saw a man walking up to Martin's house. But he didn't walk right. "How so?" Thorne prompted, leaning forward slightly. "He was tall and thin, wearing a dark coat. But when he moved, it was like watching a broken film," she explained, struggling for the words. "He'd take a step, and his leg would seem to bend in the middle, but he kept moving. When he turned his head, it was too sharp a turn, too fast. It wasn't natural." She paused, her brow furrowed in concentration. "He was made of wrong angles. That's the only way I can say it. Every movement was a straight line, a sharp corner where a curve should be. He didn't open the door. He just stood in front of it, and then he was on the other side of it." Chen jotted notes, her pen hovering over the page. The testimony sounded like the confused ramblings of an elderly witness, the kind of statement that would be politely documented and then summarily ignored. She glanced at Thorne, expecting a subtle sign to wrap up the interview. But Thorne's expression was one of intense focus. He wasn't dismissing a single word. "Did you see his face, Alma?" She shook her head slowly. "No. There was a face, but it had no features. Just planes. Like a badly carved stone. I felt sick watching him. I had to look away." They sat in silence for a moment, the ticking of a grandfather clock filling the room. Thorne eventually rose. "Thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez. You've been a great help." As they walked back to their car, Chen couldn't hold her skepticism. "A man made of wrong angles?" "Thorne, that's not a lead, I don't know what that is." "It's a witness description, Chen," Thorne replied, his voice low and serious as he started the car. "And it's the most accurate one we're ever going to get. The forensics team is looking for a killer who obeys the laws of nature. Alma Rodriguez is the only one who saw the one that doesn't." The precinct's main evidence locker was a brightly lit, climate-controlled facility managed by a digital inventory system. Thorne led Chen past its sterile entrance, down a flight of concrete stairs that weren't on any public building plans, to a heavy steel door marked only with a faded stencil auxiliary storage. He unlocked it with a simple, old-fashioned brass key. The air that rolled out to meet them was cool and dry, thick with the scent of aging paper, ozone, and something else, a faint, metallic tang like old wiring. This was the registry. It was an analog library of the impossible, a place where the city's institutional memory stored the cases that officially never happened. Endless rows of tall, rolling metal shelves filled the sub-basement, crammed not with standard manila folders but with leather-bound ledgers, heavy document boxes tied with twine, and strange, catalogued artifacts sealed in lead-lined containers. There wasn't a computer in sight. "The digital system can be hacked, erased, or altered," Thorne said, his voice hushed in the cavernous silence, broken only by the hum of an ancient ventilation fan. "This place can't. Every 4:15 Bravo, every unexplained disappearance, every incident report that ends with a question mark instead of a period, ends up here. He moved with a quiet familiarity through the narrow aisles, his fingers trailing along the spines of dusty ledgers. Chen followed, her eyes taking in the sheer, overwhelming volume of forgotten history. She saw labels on boxes that read the Tinley Park Hung, 1994 and subway platform displacements, 2003. This wasn't just a collection of cold cases, it was a catalog of impossibilities. Thorne stopped at a specific section labeled Geometric Spatial Phenomena. He ran his hand over a series of identical brown document boxes before pulling one down. The label, written in faded fountain pen ink, read Case File 781109. Homicide. Victim Davies, Albert. A thick layer of dust puffed from its surface. He carried the box to a solitary wooden table under a bare, caged lightbulb and untied the string. Inside was a file, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The top sheet was a standard homicide report from 1978, filled out on a typewriter. The investigating officer's name was listed as Detective Frank Miller. Thorne carefully turned the pages, revealing a series of black and white crime scene photographs. Chen leaned in, a cold knot forming in her gut. The victim in the photos, Albert Davies, was seated in an armchair in a cluttered apartment. And his head was folded, creased into the same geometrically nightmarish state as Martin Fincher. The blood spatter on the wall behind him was a different pattern, but it followed the same unnatural rules, a cascade of perfect right angles. "It's identical," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Almost," Thorne corrected. He flipped to a supplemental report, a few pages of handwritten notes from Detective Miller. The detective described the scene with a mix of professional detachment and barely concealed shock. He wrote about the way the corners of the room seemed unsettled, and how his compass needle spun uselessly near the body. Then Thorne slid the final document from the file. It was a witness statement, but attached to it with a rusty paperclip was a sketch, drawn in pencil on the back of a booking form. It depicted a tall, slender figure in a long coat. The form was humanoid, but its proportions were subtly wrong. Its limbs were drawn with a ruler, straight lines meaning at sharp, jarring angles. There was no face, just a collection of flat, intersecting planes. It was a crude, desperate drawing, the work of a man trying to document something his mind could not properly process. It was, without question, Alma Rodriguez's man made of wrong angles. Detective Miller had a witness, too, Thorne said, tapping a line in the report. A delivery boy who saw this thing approach the apartment building. The kid quit his job the next day and left town. Miller was the only one who took him seriously. He closed the file, the sound echoing softly in the vast, silent room. "This isn't a new event, Chen. It's a recurring one. Frank Miller saw it in '78. We're seeing it now. The only question is how many times it's happened in between." Thorne's phone vibrated against the worn wood of the table in the registry. The caller ID displayed a name he both respected and dreaded seeing after a 4:15, Bravo Drive. Kenji Tanaka, Chief Medical Examiner. Thorne answered, putting the call on speaker for Chen to hear. "Elias," Tanaka's voice came through, sharp and devoid of its usual professional warmth. "I need you to come down to the morgue. Now." "Can't, Kenji. Tied up in archives," Thorne replied evenly. "What have you got?" There was a pause on the other end, filled with a sound like a heavy sigh or the rustle of a paper suit. "I've finished the preliminary on your Mr. Fincher. Officially, for the report you're going to file, the cause of death will be listed as a catastrophic, multifocal cerebral hemorrhage. A series of cascading aneurysms so severe they caused instantaneous brain death. It's plausible enough that no one will question it." "And unofficially?" Thorne asked, his eyes meeting Chen's. The silence that followed was heavy with intellectual exhaustion. "Unofficially," Tanaka began, his voice dropping lower, tighter, "I have no idea what I am looking at. I've been a coroner for 25 years. I have seen every form of death this city can invent, from the mundane to the grotesquely creative. This is not one of them." He took a breath. "We took tissue samples from the brain, the heart, the liver. Under the microscope, Elias, the cellular structure is wrong. It's not damaged, not necrotic, not cancerous. It's inverted. Chen frowned, puzzled by the term. Explain, Thorne said simply. It's not a medical term because it's not a medical possibility. Tanaka's voice rose, frayed with frustration. The cell membranes are inside out. The organelles, the mitochondria, the ribosomes are reversed. It's as if every single cell in his body was turned inside out on a molecular level, simultaneously. The DNA in the nucleus is still a double helix, but it's coiled left-handed. That's not a mutation, that's a violation of biology. He let the information hang in the air. There's no mechanism for this. No poison, no radiation, no disease I've ever heard of that could do this. It's a perfect, systemic inversion. The body is just a negative image of itself. So, you tell me, Elias. What in God's name did you find at that scene? What kind of weapon leaves a man's head looking like a collapsed box and rewrites his biology at the atomic level? Thorne was silent for a long moment, letting Tanaka's frustration peak and recede. He was a good man, a brilliant scientist, and Thorne was about to feed him a professional lie. It was a necessary part of the job, but it never felt right. It's a post-mortem artifact, Kenji, Thorne said, his voice a calm, authoritative fiction. Undetermined origin. Probably related to the severity of the hemorrhage. We're seeing some strange environmental factors at the scene that may have contributed. An unusual magnetic field from faulty wiring, maybe. A short, bitter laugh crackled over the speaker. Faulty wiring. Right. Tanaka's voice was flat now, defeated. I'll write it up as requested, Elias. Aneurysm. Artifacts of unknown etiology. But I'm quarantining these samples under a biohazard 4 protocol. And I'm telling you, as a friend, that you need to be careful. Whatever you're not telling me, it doesn't follow the rules. The line went dead. Thorne pocketed his phone, the silence of the registry pressing in around them once more. Chen looked at him, her expression a mixture of awe and apprehension. Cellular inversion? Left-handed DNA? New data points, Thorne said, his gaze distant. The entity doesn't just break the laws of physics. It rewrites the laws of life. Before sealing the file on Albert Davies, Thorne retrieved one more item from the document box, a heavy, handheld device that looked like a cross between a Geiger counter and an antique radio. A copper antenna protruded from the top, and its main feature was a large, unlit vacuum tube set behind a brass mesh. A single dial, marked with cryptic symbols instead of numbers, sat below it. He handed it to Chen. This is a resonant echolocator, he said, his voice flat. Or a dissonant one, in this case. Events like the one on Ash Street leave a harmonic signature, a kind of metaphysical residue. This device doesn't detect sound, it listens for the vibrations left when natural laws are broken. They returned to Martin Fincher's house under the pretense of a final evidence sweep, long after the official crime scene unit had departed. The police tape was still up, a flimsy yellow barrier against an intangible threat. Inside, the chemical smell of luminol and fingerprint powder hung in the air, a testament to the conventional investigation's dead end. Thorne took the locator from Chen. He stood in the center of the living room, where the gravitational field had been warped, and twisted the dial. A low, static hiss emanated from the brass grill. He turned the dial slowly, methodically, until the static coalesced into a sound, a grating, discordant hum, like a cello string being scraped with a jagged piece of metal. It was a single, painful note that seemed to vibrate in the bones rather than the ears. The vacuum tube behind the mesh began to glow with a faint, sickly purple light. That's the echo, Thorne said. Our perpetrator's signature tune. Now we follow it. He held the device out, sweeping it in a slow arc. The hum grew marginally louder, the purple glow marginally brighter, when the antenna pointed toward the front door and out into the street. Their trail began. The journey was a strange and silent one. They drove through the city, the only sound in the car the unsettling hum from the locator resting on the dashboard. The purple light was their compass. The trail did not follow a logical path of roads and turns. It cut diagonally across city blocks, through buildings and parks, forcing Thorne to navigate a circuitous route that kept them as close to the invisible line as possible. For Chen, the experience was profoundly disorienting. She was a cop, trained to follow physical leads, tire tracks, footprints, paper trails. This was like chasing a ghost with a dowsing rod. The signal led them away from the manicured lawns and quiet cul-de-sacs of the suburbs, deeper into the city's heart. The neighborhoods became older, the buildings more tightly packed, the streets narrower. The architecture shifted from modern siding and asphalt shingles to weathered brick and old stone. The hum from the device grew steadily in pitch and intensity, the single grating note now accompanied by a second, lower one, creating a harmony that was fundamentally wrong. Finally, the locator guided them into the city's old industrial quarter, a forgotten labyrinth of abandoned warehouses and crumbling factories. Thorne parked the car in a desolate, cobblestone alley that smelled of damp decay and stagnant water. He killed the engine, and the dissonant two-note hum now seemed to fill the sudden silence. He and Chen got out, the locator held in Thorne's steady hand. The purple glow was now bright enough to cast faint shadows on the graffiti-covered walls. He swept the device left, then right. The sound reached its crescendo when the antenna pointed directly down at their feet. Chen looked down. There, set into the cracked and weed-choked cobblestones, was a simple, unassuming storm drain, its cast iron grate rusted a deep, angry orange. The discordant hum pulsed from it, a silent scream that only their strange equipment could hear. The trail of metaphysical energy, the echo of a murder that bent reality, ended here. It didn't lead to a person or a house, but into the darkness beneath the city's skin. Using a crowbar from the trunk, Thorne pried the heavy iron grate free with a groan of protesting metal. A wave of cool, subterranean air washed over them, carrying the scent of moss and wet earth. He handed Chen a high-lumen flashlight, took one for himself, and they descended a rusted ladder into the darkness below. They were in a wide, circular drainage nexus, a junction where several smaller tunnels converged. A sluggish trickle of water ran through a central channel, its sound echoing in the oppressive silence. The dissonant hum from the locator was gone, replaced by a profound, listening quiet. "The echo led us to the entrance," Thorne said, his voice low. "Whatever we're looking for is shielded from the device down here." He swept his flashlight beam across the curved brick walls, illuminating decades of grime and the slow creep of calcite formations. Chen played her own light over the tunnels leading away from the nexus. One of them, a smaller, older-looking brick archway, seemed different. While the others were slick with moisture, this one was bone-dry. A faint, almost imperceptible draft emanated from its mouth. "Thorne," she said, pointing her light. "That one." They moved into the tunnel, their footsteps crunching softly on the sandy floor. The air grew colder, and the silence deepened. After about 50 yards, the tunnel ended abruptly in the solid brick wall. It was a dead end. "Must have been a wrong turn," Chen said, a hint of disappointment in her voice. Thorne didn't answer. He ran his hand over the brickwork, his fingers probing the mortar. He stopped at a section where the pattern of the bricks was subtly different, the mortar a slightly lighter shade of gray. He pressed firmly on a specific brick. With a low grinding of stone on stone, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a dark, square opening. The space beyond was not a sewer tunnel. It was a small, man-made chamber, about 10 feet square, its walls and floor made of smooth, poured concrete. The air inside was stale and utterly still. In the center of the room was a simple wooden stool, and scattered around it were books on theoretical physics and non-Euclidean geometry, their pages swollen and warped by the damp. This was not part of the city's infrastructure, it was a hidden study, a secret sanctuary. But it was the walls that commanded their attention. Every available inch of the concrete was covered in frantic, overlapping script, written in what looked like charcoal and chalk. There were complex mathematical equations, star charts mapping unfamiliar constellations, and jagged, panicked sketches of the angular figure. It was a lexicon of obsession, a diary of a descent into a terrifying truth. Chen moved closer, her flashlight beam illuminating a large section of text. The handwriting was precise at the top, but grew increasingly erratic and jagged as it descended the wall. "It comes through the angles," she read aloud. "It can't exist in curves." The universe is a protection of smooth, flowing lines. We are safe in the arcs, the circles, the waves. But where lines meet, where corners are formed, it finds a door. Her light moved to another section. I saw it first as a mathematical anomaly in my research, a recurring variable that violated causality. I built the resonance detectors to track it. I thought I was the hunter. The writing grew messier here, the letters sharp and angry. But it was a lure. It knew I was watching. It perceives through observation of its own nature. To learn of it is to be known by it. Thorne found the final entry, scrawled near the floor in thick, desperate strokes. My name is Martin Fincher. I was wrong to look. It is a thing of pure, predatory mathematics. A Tyndallosian echo. It hunts those who see the scenes of reality. It is coming for me now. It comes from the corner of my eye. God, the angles. The words trailed off into a meaningless scratch. Martin Fincher, their victim, had not been a random target. He was a researcher who had found something he wasn't supposed to find, and it had followed him home from his hidden study. This chamber wasn't a sanctuary, it was a blind, from which he had hunted a predator that was, in turn, hunting him. EOT. The drive back from the industrial quarter was a somber, silent affair. Fincher's frantic warnings echoed in the confines of the car, a chilling counterpoint to the city's mundane late-night traffic. To learn of it is to be known by it. The words had shifted the nature of their investigation from a homicide to something far more personal and predatory. They weren't just pursuing a killer, they were now marked by it. They were halfway back to the precinct when the radio squawked to life, the dispatcher's voice pulling them from their thoughts. All units, be advised. Requesting a welfare check at 1123 North Ash Street. Neighbor reports hearing a sharp, cracking sound, followed by silence. No answer on the phone. Chen's blood ran cold. 1123 North Ash. The bungalow with the overgrown rose bushes. Alma Rodriguez's house. Thorne didn't wait for the dispatch. He hit the lights and siren, the sudden wail cutting through the night. He took a corner so sharply that Chen was thrown against the door, his movements no longer calm and deliberate but fueled by a grim, urgent certainty. They were too late. When they arrived, the street was just as they'd left it hours before, bathed in the gentle, amber glow of the streetlights. A single patrol car was already on scene, its officer standing on the sidewalk, looking uncertainly at the dark house. Thorne and Chen were out of their car before it had fully stopped. "What's the status?" Thorne demanded of the officer. No answer at the door, detective, the officer reported. "Front and back are locked tight. All the windows are secured. It's quiet as a tomb in there." "Then we make entry," Thorne said, striding toward the front door. He didn't bother with procedure or waiting for a warrant. He kicked the door just beside the lock, the wood splintering with a loud crack. They entered the small home, weapons drawn, slicing the pie of the dark living room. The house was still. The scent of lemon polish and old books was still in the air, but it was now tainted by the sharp, electric smell of ozone. Chen found the light switch, and the room flooded with a soft, worn light that did nothing to dispel the cold dread that had settled in the space. Alma Rodriguez was in her armchair, the one she had sat in while telling them her story. She wasn't folded like Fincher. She was absent. The chair was empty, but her floral print dress was still there, draped over the arms and seat as if the person wearing it had simply evaporated. On the floor beside the chair lay her glasses, one lens shattered into a perfect, spiderwebbing pattern of 90-degree cracks. Thorne knelt, his expression grim. He didn't need the specialized equipment from the registry to read the scene. The faint smell of ozone, the impossible state of the evidence, the profound sense of violation in the still air, it was all the signature they needed. He looked at the walls, the ceiling. In the corner of the room, where the two walls and ceiling met, the plaster was darker, stained a deep, bruised gray. It was a doorway that shouldn't exist. "It perceives through observation," Chen said, her voice a hollow whisper, reciting Fincher's words. "She saw it. We talked to her. We made her a part of it." The implication was a physical weight. Their investigation had just uncovered a murder. It had created a new victim. Their questions had been a death sentence. Thorne rose and looked at Chen, his eyes dark with the cold, contained fury. The rules had changed. This was no longer a reactive investigation. The entity was now actively pruning the threads of knowledge, eliminating anyone who could give it a name or a shape. First Fincher, the researcher. Now Alma, the witness. It knows we saw her, Thorne said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of command. It knows we heard her story. It knows we found Fincher's work. He holstered his weapon, the click of the retention strap unnaturally loud in the silent house. We're not the investigators anymore, Chen. We're the loose ends. Thorne left the uniformed officer at Alma's house with a curt, fabricated story about a possible abduction by a relative, an official narrative thin enough to hold for a few hours. The drive back to the precinct was charged with a new, dangerous energy. The passive phase of their work, investigation, documentation, and observation, was over. They had crossed a threshold, and the entity was now aware of them in a way that demanded a response beyond filing a report in a forgotten archive. Instead of heading to the detective's bullpen, Thorne led Chen to the precinct's communications room. He bypassed the main dispatch consoles and went to a small, unmarked office in the back. Inside, a single, outdated server rack hummed quietly. On the wall was a locked, gray metal box with a rotary dial phone mounted on its front. It was a closed-loop system, a hardline that connected to only 3 other numbers in the entire city, none of which were listed in any directory. He took a key from his pocket, unlocked the box, and lifted the heavy receiver. He didn't dial. He simply waited. After a few seconds, a click sounded on the line, followed by a quiet, expectant silence. "This is Thorne," he said, his voice low and steady. "I am invoking Protocol 7. Authentication Miller, 78-1109. He paused, letting the reference to the old case file register. "The subject is active and has escalated to witness elimination. We are now targets. Acknowledge." A calm, female voice responded from the other end, devoid of surprise or alarm. "Protocol 7 is acknowledged, Detective Thorne. Asset is en route to your location. ETA 10 minutes. The line went dead. Thorne hung up the receiver and locked the box. "What was that?" Chen asked, her hand resting near the butt of her holstered sidearm. "What is Protocol 7? "Most of what we do is reactive," Thorne explained, turning to face her. "We document, we archive, we contain the knowledge. But some threats don't stay in the past. When a subject becomes actively hostile and demonstrates an ability to target specific individuals, we move from passive containment of information to active containment of the threat itself." He leaned against the server rack, the quiet hum a stark contrast to the urgency of the moment. Protocol 7 activates the response. It's a small, specialized unit. People who aren't just aware of the addendum, but are equipped to enforce it. Less than 10 minutes later, a young man in the plain blue uniform of a patrol officer walked into the communications office. He had a wiry build, a cascade of unruly black hair, and an easygoing smile that seemed utterly out of place. He carried a large, heavy-duty toolbox. "Detective," he said with a nod to Thorne, then glanced at Chen. "You must be the new partner." Then Carter. He offered a hand to Chen, his grip surprisingly firm. "I'm the precinct's unofficial IT guy. Officer Carter is our tech specialist," Thorne clarified. "His expertise is not in servers and mainframes, but in applied theoretical mechanics. He builds the tools we can't requisition." Carter set his toolbox on a table and opened it. The contents were not wrenches and screwdrivers, but a jumble of exposed circuit boards, powerful magnets, intricately wound copper coils, and salvaged scientific instruments. He pulled out a small, handheld device with a flickering digital screen. "I heard the chatter on the line," Carter said, his smile fading as he switched to a more serious tone. "Tyndallosian echo. That's a heavy one. Old school nasty. Frank Miller almost lost his mind chasing that thing back in the day." He looked from Thorne to Chen. You too have its attention, which means it will be actively trying to find a corner to step through into your lives. From now on, you stick to rooms with curved walls when you can. No sharp angles. Stay out of elevators, closets, the corners of your own apartments. He tapped a few commands into his device. So, the objective is containment. How do we plan to bait the hook? The three of them relocated to a place far removed from the angular hallways of the main precinct, a domed, circular room that had once served as the building's observatory before the city's light pollution rendered it useless. Now it was Carter's workshop, a chaotic space filled with half-assembled devices, esoteric schematics pinned to curving walls, and the persistent smell of solder and ozone. The only light came from portable work lamps that cast long, soft-edged shadows. There were no corners here. Chen unfurled photographs of Martin Fincher's notes that she'd taken in the hidden chamber, laying them out on a large, round table in the center of the room. He called it a thing of pure, predatory mathematics, she said, tapping one of the images. He believed it was drawn to his research, to the mathematical anomalies he was studying. Carter leaned over the photos, his eyes scanning the complex equations with an unnerving fluency. He's not just talking about numbers, Carter murmured, tracing a lone, looping formula with his finger. He's talking about concepts. Look here. He's mapping the distribution of prime numbers, calculating the Mandelbrot set to 1,000 decimal places, trying to find a pattern in pi. These aren't just calculations, they're explorations into the nature of infinity and chaos. Fincher thought his observation of the entity was what attracted it, Thorne added, his arms crossed as he watched Carter work. But his notes suggest it might be the other way around. The entity is drawn to a certain kind of thought, a certain kind of order. The kind of acute, hyper-complex logic that bends the mind. Carter straightened up, a spark of understanding in his eyes. So, it's like a shark smelling blood in the water. Except the blood is abstract thought. Fincher was ringing a dinner bell with his brain. He began pacing the curved perimeter of the room, running a hand through his already messy hair. We can't fight it. It doesn't have a physical form to shoot or a biological system to poison. But if it's a predator, it has instincts. And we can exploit them. He stopped and turned back to the table, his demeanor shifting from analytical to creative. We need a lure. Not just a sound or a light, but a conceptual beacon. Something so mathematically delicious that it can't ignore it. We need to create a signal so pure and complex that it will draw the entity to a single point, a place of our choosing. He began rummaging through his toolbox and several large plastic bins stacked against the wall, pulling out components. A Babbage-style analytical gear from a museum replica, a series of precisely calibrated tuning forks, a crystalline matrix from a decommissioned atomic clock. I'm going to build a differential engine, Carter announced, laying the pieces out on the table. Not a digital computer, but a mechanical one. All gears and levers and tangible calculations. Well tasked with a single, impossible function to calculate a transcendental number, like Lavilla's constant, in real time. A number that can't be the solution to any polynomial equation with rational coefficients, Chen said, the definition surfacing from a long-forgotten college math class. Exactly, Carter confirmed with a grin. It's a number that is infinitely non-repeating, a perfect representation of ordered chaos. The clicking of the gears, the resonance of the forks as they align to each new digit, the sheer, relentless purity of the calculation, it will be an irresistible siren song for a creature made of math. He picked up a soldering iron, its tip beginning to glow hot. It will come for the machine. And when it does, that's when you'll be ready to spring the trap. I just need a few hours and a lot of coffee. While Carter worked, lost in a focused trance of soldering and calibration, Thorne and Chen stood watch. The domed observatory was their sanctuary, a space defined by curves and arcs, theoretically safe from a creature that hunted through angles. But as the hours stretched into the deep, pre-dawn quiet, a subtle wrongness began to seep into the precinct building around them. It started with the lights. The steady, fluorescent hum of the main building's lighting began to flicker, not in a random, sputtering way, but in a slow, rhythmic pulse, like a faltering heartbeat. Chen, posted by the observatory's heavy, rounded door, was the first to notice. She watched the sliver of light under the door dim and brighten with a disconcerting regularity. "Thorne," she called softly. "Power fluctuations." Thorne joined her at the door, his hand resting on the cool metal of the handle. He didn't need to look. He could feel it. A faint, low-frequency vibration was thrumming through the building's very foundation, a dissonance that was less a sound and more a pressure against the eardrums. "It's not the power grid," he said. "It knows we're here. It's testing the perimeter." Chen cracked the heavy door open just enough to peer into the hallway beyond. The corridor, a straight, 50-foot stretch leading to the central staircase, seemed longer. The far end was shrouded in a dim, murky haze, the exit sign a blurry red smudge that seemed miles away. The perspective was distorted, like looking through the wrong end of a telescope. She pulled the door shut, the heavy thud of the lock echoing in the round room. "The hallway," she said, her voice tight. "It's stretched. The geometry is unstable." Inside the dome, Carter remained oblivious, his attention fixed on the intricate clockwork of his machine. The rhythmic clicking of the gears was the only normal sound in the growing strangeness. A sharp rapping sound came from the other side of the room. Thorne and Chen turned, weapons drawn. There was a second door, a smaller service access that led to the building's roof. It was supposed to be a solid steel plate, bolted from the inside. Now, it had a small, square window in it that had not been there moments before. Through the glass, they could see not the night sky over the city, but the interior of the precinct's brightly lit evidence lockup, 2 floors below. A uniformed officer was visible through the impossible window, calmly cataloging evidence, completely unaware that a portal had opened a few feet from his head. The window vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving the smooth, solid steel of the door behind. "It's not just observing anymore," Thorne stated, his voice a low growl. "It's probing. Looking for an angle. It's treating the building's architecture like a puzzle box, trying to find a way in." The final and most unnerving change came through the radio on Chen's belt. It crackled to life, but it wasn't the dispatcher's voice that came through. It was a perfect, crystal-clear recording of Alma Rodriguez. He was made of wrong angles, her voice echoed in the silent room, a ghostly artifact of her last testimony. Every movement was a straight line, a sharp corner the broadcast cut out, replaced by a high-pitched squeal that made them both flinch. Thorne looked at Carter, who was now fitting the final gear into his complex machine. "How much longer, Ben?" "Almost there," Carter muttered, not looking up. "Just need to align the primary resonator." The main door to the observatory rattled violently in its frame, a deep, metallic groan echoing through the room. A thin, perfectly straight black line appeared in the center of the rounded door, a crack not in the metal, but in the space it occupied. The line began to spread, branching out at perfect 90-degree angles. The sanctuary was about to be breached. The black, angular crack on the observatory door splintered outward, not with the sound of tearing metal, but with the chilling, high-frequency tone of shattering crystal. The heavy door didn't break, it unfolded, collapsing in on itself like a piece of paper being creased into a complex shape, and then vanished. Where the exit had been, there was now only a stark, geometric archway leading into a hallway that pulsed with a faint, predatory light. Beyond the threshold, the precinct was no longer the familiar building they knew. It had become a non-Euclidean nightmare. Hallways stretched into impossible lengths, intersected at jarring, acute angles, and ended in sheer drops into darkness. Staircases coiled back on themselves, leading nowhere. Doors stood freestanding in the middle of corridors, opening into brick walls or, worse, into other, identical corridors, creating a dizzying, recursive loop. The laws of architecture and physics had been suspended, replaced by a malevolent, alien logic. "It's inside," Thorne stated, his voice a low, steady anchor in the disorienting chaos. He and Chen instinctively moved to flank the new, impossible doorway, their weapons raised. "Carter." "Status." "Almost got it." Carter yelled back, his voice strained. He was hunched over the differential engine, his hands a blur as he made the final, delicate adjustments. The rhythmic clicking of the machine was now their only constant, a small island of rational order in a sea of architectural madness. A shape began to coalesce in the distorted hallway beyond the archway. It was tall and painfully thin, composed of shifting, intersecting planes of shadow and a deep, light-devouring black. It had the rough silhouette of a man in a long coat, but it moved with a horrifying, staccato gait, each step a violation of motion. It was the man of wrong angles, given form. Chen fired first, 2 rounds in quick succession. The bullets didn't ricochet, they simply vanished a few feet from the target, their kinetic energy absorbed without a trace. The entity didn't even flinch. It continued its jagged, unnatural advance. "Fall back," Thorne ordered, pulling Chen away from the doorway. "Barricade it." They shoved a heavy, round workbench in front of the archway, but it was a futile gesture against a threat that didn't obey physical laws. The entity didn't break through the barricade, it simply stepped around it, its form bending at an impossible angle as if the space between the bench and the wall was a vast, open field. The psychological assault intensified. The distorted hallways echoed with a cacophony of sounds. The static-laced voice of the dispatcher from the night Fincher was killed, the tearing metal sound the neighbors had reported, the faint, desperate whisper of Fincher's own voice from his hidden chamber. It was a symphony of their investigation, weaponized against them. Chen felt a wave of vertigo as the floor beneath her feet seemed to tilt, the curve of the observatory wall momentarily flattening into a sharp, 90-degree corner. She stumbled, catching herself on the central table. The entity was not just invading the precinct, it was trying to collapse their sanctuary, to create the very angles it needed to fully manifest within their safe room. "It's here!" she shouted, her voice tight with a rising panic. "Hold the line," Thorne commanded. His focus wasn't on the creature itself, but on the room. He was watching the walls, the floor, tracking the subtle, invasive shifts in geometry. He understood that they weren't fighting a physical intruder, but a hostile environment. Their survival depended on maintaining the integrity of their curved space. The entity was now only a few feet away, its featureless, planar face turning towards Carter and the machine. The rhythmic clicking of the gears seemed to be the only thing holding its full attention. "It's done!" Carter shouted, flipping a final switch. The differential engine whirred to life with a new sound, a series of clear, resonant chimes that harmonized with the mechanical clicking. A small display on the device began to flicker with an endless, non-repeating stream of digits. The lure was active. The angular creature paused, its jagged form seeming to vibrate in tune with the machinist's calculations. It had taken the bait. But they were still trapped with it, in a collapsing building, with no clear path to the trap they had intended to set. The moment Carter's machine chimed to life, the entity ceased its advance. It remained fixed, a statue of impossible geometry, its entire alien consciousness seemingly captivated by the pure, unending stream of transcendental numbers emanating from the differential engine. The aggressive warping of the room subsided, the walls and floor settling back into their familiar curves. The oppressive, cacophonous sounds from the hallway died down, replaced by a tense, humming silence. They had bought themselves a reprieve. "It's mesmerized," Carter breathed, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a greasy hand. "The calculation is a perfect, infinite, ordered line. It can't look away. But how long will that hold?" "Not long enough," Thorne said, his eyes still locked on the silent, angular figure. "We have the bait, but the trap isn't set. We can't get this machine out of the room, and we can't contain that thing in here." Their sanctuary had become their prison. The entity was held at bay by the lure, but it also blocked their only exit, its very presence a promise of renewed assault the moment its fascination waned. While Thorne and Carter assessed their tactical nightmare, Chen's mind raced back to the registry. They were missing something. A detail, a clue. She scrambled for the file on the 1978 case, which she had brought with them from the archive. She ripped open the twine-bound folder, her fingers fumbling with the brittle, yellowed pages. She scanned Miller's typed reports, the witness statements, the crude sketch. There had to be something more. Her fingers caught on the inside of the folder itself. Tucked into a flap of the cardboard, almost completely hidden, was a small, folded piece of paper, separate from the main file. It was a handwritten addendum, the ink faded and the script nearly illegible, the desperate scrawl of a man pushed to his absolute limit. It was Frank Miller's final, unsent memo. Miller's notes, she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. She unfolded the fragile paper and began to read aloud. The resonance locator led me to it, but the standard containment protocols failed. It cannot be bound by physical means. It does not exist in a way that can be caged by steel or concrete. It is a thing of logic, of axioms. To trap it, you cannot build a better wall, you must present it with a flawed equation. She paused, her brow furrowing as she deciphered the next few lines. It is drawn to order, to the sharp, clean lines of certainty. Therefore, it can only be repelled and contained by a paradox. Not a theoretical paradox, but a functional one. An act that violates the fundamental, axiomatic nature of its observer. Chen looked up from the page, her eyes meeting Thorne's. The final lines of Miller's note were underlined 3 times, the pressure of the pen having torn through the paper in his urgency. The anchor must be an oath. A sworn duty, broken willingly. An officer of the law, a symbol of order, must commit a knowing and deliberate violation of that order. Plant evidence. Falsify a report. Bear false witness. The act itself creates a localized contradiction, a logical impossibility that the entity cannot process or cross. It will be drawn to the lower but repelled by the anchor, trapped in the impossible space between the two. It is the only way. I could not bring myself to do it. God forgive me. A heavy silence descended upon the observatory, deeper and more profound than the one that had come before. Carter stared at them, his face pale. The solution was not in his technology or Thorne's tactical experience. It was a moral and ethical poison pill, a required act of self-violation. To trap the creature of absolute, predatory order, one of them had to become a symbol of absolute chaos. One of them had to break the very code they had sworn their lives to uphold. Thorne looked from the mesmerized entity to the resolute expression on Chen's face, and then down at the polished silver badge pinned to his own uniform. He finally understood the true cost of containment. Frank Miller had found the answer decades ago but had lacked the will to pay the price. Now, the bill had come due once again. With a plan in place, a desperate, soul-crushing plan, they moved. Carter carefully disconnected the differential engine from its power source, the chimes and clicks dying into an abrupt silence. The angular entity in the hallway convulsed, a silent, violent shudder, its form momentarily losing cohesion as its focal point vanished. It took a jagged step forward. That was their window. Go! Thorne commanded. Chen and Carter grabbed the machine and ran, not through the shifting, malevolent hallways, but through the small service door that had earlier shown them a glimpse of the evidence locker. Thorne had pried it open during the lull, revealing not a portal, but a cramped, dark service ladder leading down through the building's core. It was a curving, tight spiral, a path with no angles. Thorne followed them, pulling the heavy door shut just as the entity reached their abandoned sanctuary. They descended in near darkness, the heavy bulk of the engine a deadweight between them, the only sound their ragged breaths and the scraping of their boots on the metal rungs. They emerged into the quiet solitude of the precinct's main atrium. It was a vast, open, circular space, 2 stories high with a terrazzo floor polished to a mirror sheen. High above, a domed skylight showed the first pale, gray hints of dawn. This would be their arena. Carter set up the differential engine in the precise center of the room, the machine's intricate brass and steel workings looking like a strange, arcane altar. Chen took up a defensive position by the main entrance, her shotgun held at a low ready, her job to ensure no unsuspecting officer wandered into the unfolding nightmare. Thorne walked to a spot about 20 feet from the machine. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of stale coffee and floor wax. This was it. The culmination of his duty, and its ultimate betrayal. He reached into a small evidence bag head retrieved from the locker and pulled out a single, pristine 9mm shell casing, evidence from an old, unrelated case, clean and properly catalogued. He then unpinned his badge from his uniform. The silver shield felt impossibly heavy in his hand, a weight not of metal, but of years of service, of every oath sworn and every law upheld. He placed the badge on the polished floor. The reflection of the atrium's soft lights glinted off its surface. Carter, now, Thorne said, his voice hard, emotionless. Carter flipped the switch. The differential engine hummed to life, its resonant chimes and rhythmic clicks filling the vast, silent atrium. The lure was active again, a beacon of pure, irresistible logic. Almost instantly, a corner of the atrium darkened. Not a shadow, but an absolute absence of light. The darkness sharpened, folded, and stepped out into the room. The Tyndallosian echo had arrived, drawn from the labyrinth of its own making by the siren song of the machine. It ignored Thorne and Chen, its entire being focused on the source of the beautiful, perfect calculation. It began its staccato, unnatural walk toward the center of the room. Thorne knelt beside his badge. He looked at the silver shield, at the embossed words to protect and to serve. He took the clean shell casing between his thumb and forefinger. His hand trembled, just once. This act would stain him in a way no physical wound ever could. It was a self-inflicted injury to his very soul. He recited the words, the formal language of evidence handling, his voice a dead monotone that echoed slightly in the atrium. On this date, at this time, I am marking into evidence one 9mm shell casing, recovered at the scene. He paused, forcing the next words out, each one a shard of glass in his throat. This evidence was recovered from the person of Detective Elias Thorne and is being logged as directly pertaining to the Fincher homicide. He placed the casing on top of his badge. The lie was told. The evidence was planted. The oath was broken. The instant the casing touched the badge, the air around Thorne crackled with an invisible energy. The floor beneath the badge seemed to warp, the polished terrazzo turning a milky, opaque white in a perfect circle 10 feet in diameter. The entity, halfway to the machine, froze. It turned its featureless, planar head, not toward the machine, but toward Thorne and the circle of paradoxical energy now radiating from his broken oath. It could feel the lure of pure logic ahead. But behind it, emanating from Thorne, was a profound, fundamental wrongness, a violation of the very axiomatic order upon which it was built. It was trapped between an irresistible force and an immovable contradiction. The circle of milky white floor around Thorne's badge did not just glow, it seemed to absorb the light around it, creating a pocket of profound visual silence. The Tyndallosian echo, caught between the pull of the machine and the repellent force of the paradox, began to distort. Its sharp, clean lines wavered, blurring as if seen through a heat haze. The absolute black of its form flickered with shades of gray, its internal geometry struggling to reconcile the two opposing, absolute forces. A low, grating sound filled the atrium, the same dissonant hum they had first heard on the locator, but now magnified 1,000 times, a sound of pure metaphysical friction. The entity was being torn apart, not by a physical force, but by a logical one. It could not advance toward the perfect order of the machine while the perfect disorder of Thorne's broken oath existed behind it. The contradiction was absolute. Slowly, inexorably, the anomaly around the badge began to exert its own gravity. The entity was pulled backward, not through space, but into the conceptual void that Thorne had created. Its jagged form stretched, thinned, and was drawn into the milky circle on the floor. It was like watching a wisp of smoke being sucked into a vacuum cleaner. It did not struggle or fight, it simply unraveled, its axiomatic structure failing under the strain of the paradox. As the last of its angular shadow was drawn into the circle, the dissonant hum cut off, replaced by a deafening, final silence. The moment the entity vanished, the precinct shuddered. From the floors above, they heard a series of deep, resonant thuds, like the settling of a great weight. The lights flickered once, twice, and then held steady, their familiar fluorescent hum returning. The subtle pressure in the air, the feeling of being watched by a hostile geometry, was gone. The building felt like itself again, solid, mundane, and blessedly normal. The milky circle on the floor faded, the polished terrazzo returning to its normal, reflective state. All that remained was Thorne's badge with the single, damning shell casing resting on top of it. The breach was closed. Carter scrambled to the differential engine and switched it off, the intricate chimes and clicks ceasing. He looked over at Thorne, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. Chen lowered her shotgun, the tension draining from her shoulders, and walked slowly toward the center of the atrium. Thorne remained kneeling on the floor, his head bowed. He did not look at the badge. He could feel the weight of his action settling upon him, a cold, permanent stain on his record, both official and personal. He had protected the city, he had saved his fellow officers, but he had done so by sacrificing a piece of himself, by breaking the very foundation of his identity. He had upheld his highest duty by violating his most sacred one. He finally reached out a trembling hand and picked up the badge and the casing. The metal of the shield felt cold, alien. He pocketed them both, the lie and the symbol of the truth now resting together in the darkness. When he rose to his feet and turned to face Chen, his eyes were clear and steady, but something fundamental behind them had changed. The weary certainty he had always carried was now mingled with a deep, quiet sorrow. "It's over," he said, his voice raspy. The words were for them, but also for himself, a confirmation that the battle was won, even if the personal cost was immeasurable. The entity was contained, trapped within a paradox of his own making, a prisoner of a lie he would have to carry forever. In the anemic light of the new day, the precinct was a scene of controlled, bureaucratic chaos. Maintenance crews were already cataloging the damage, attributing the buckled doorframes and cracked plaster to a series of seismic tremors that no geological instrument had recorded. The official story was already taking shape, a bland, plausible narrative designed to smooth over the cracks in reality. Thorne sat at his desk in the quiet bullpen, the rhythmic clatter of his keyboard the only sound in his small corner of the world. He was typing the official report, the final act of sanitizing the impossible. Chen stood by the window, watching the city awaken, her arms crossed. Carter had already disappeared, wheeling his remarkable machine back to the quiet solitude of his observatory workshop, his part in the drama concluded. The words appeared on Thorne's screen, a masterclass in obfuscation and professional fiction. Incident Report 2023-415B Supplemental. At approximately 0430 hours, a suspected gas leak in the sub-basement ventilation system of Precinct 13 resulted in a series of contained pressure explosions. The concussive force caused significant but non-structural damage to several corridors and doorways on the upper floors. Damage is consistent with a low-grade, deflagrative event. City engineers are on scene to assess the integrity of the gas mains. He paused, his fingers hovering over the keys. The lie about the precinct was easy. It was institutional, impersonal. The next part was harder. In a related development, the disappearance of Alma Rodriguez case file 2023 WD-078 has been reclassified. Forensic analysis of the scene at 1123 North Ash Street has determined that Ms. Rodriguez was the unintended victim of a stray bullet, originating from a gang-related altercation several blocks away. The projectile passed through the exterior wall, causing a fatal wound. The subsequent panic and shock likely led the perpetrators to enter the residence and remove the victim's body in an attempt to conceal the accidental nature of the death. The investigation is ongoing. It was a clumsy, almost insulting narrative, full of holes that any rookie detective would see through. But it was a closed loop. It provided a cause, a reason, and a path forward for the official investigation, a path that led far away from the truth. It was a story that would hold up because no one with the authority to question it would ever want to know the alternative. He finished the report, signed it, and submitted it digitally. With a final, quiet click, the horrors of the past 24 hours were officially erased, replaced by a mundane tragedy and an unfortunate industrial accident. Thorne leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in the silence. He looked at Chen, who was now looking back at him, her expression unreadable. He had been briefing her, testing her, since the first moment in that alleyway. This was the final lesson. "The job isn't about putting criminals in jail, Chen," he said, his voice quiet, weary, but firm. "Not our job, anyway. Our job is to stand on the wall. On one side is the world everyone knows, the world of traffic stops and burglaries and homicides you can solve with fingerprints and ballistics. It's a world that makes sense, even when it's ugly." He gestured vaguely at the window, at the city beyond. On the other side is everything else. The things that don't follow the rules, the things that prey on the spaces between what we know. The truth is, that wall is a very thin line. It's fragile. And our duty is to maintain it. Not just by fighting what comes across, but by patching the holes it leaves in the public's understanding of reality. He picked up a blank incident report form from his desk, holding it up. "This is our most important tool. More important than your firearm, more important than any device Carter can build. Because it allows the world to keep making sense. It protects people from the truth. And sometimes, he added, his gaze becoming distant, it requires us to sacrifice a piece of our own truth to do it. He had planted evidence. He had broken his oath. But the city was safe. The boundary was secure. For a lawman like Elias Thorne, there was no greater duty, and no greater burden. The briefing was over. Officer Maya Chen's real training had just begun. EOT. We began this briefing with the idea that some jobs start where the procedure manual ends. Now we see the true cost of writing those unwritten pages, the personal cost of maintaining that perfect circle of silence for the rest of the world. For some, the line between duty and damnation is a choice made in a silent atrium, with the fate of a city resting on a broken oath. Thank you for joining us for another entry here at Keeper of the Dark Logs. The choices these officers face are rarely simple. We have to ask, if you were in Thorne's position, could you have made the same sacrifice and broken your most sacred oath to save everyone? Until we meet again, stay vigilant. Next time, we'll open a much older file to learn what really happened to the last detective who faced the man of wrong angles and couldn't bring himself to pay the price.